So nice to see so many people here. So this is the JAMstack Meetup, and I'm going to talk about Tailwind CSS. So I hope everyone has been getting waffles and are ready to go. So my name is Magnus, and I'm primarily a programmer. But even though I'm a programmer, I care about design, and I want to make properly designed applications. And so for me, Tailwind has been a nice way of getting like a framework around the design when I build an application. And I've also been using like Bootstrap and all of these other more regular frameworks. And they kind of work nice, but eventually you always start like hitting into issues where they have this very specific styling, and you want to be you want the most optimal design, so you know what you want, and then you end up just fighting against the framework. So Tailwind is very focused on the part about custom designs. If you just want something quickly set up, then this is probably not for you. But if you really care about having like the full power and be able to use like properly design, like think about how you want your application to be and then execute that, then I find that Tailwind is a really good choice. So I'm not actually sure if anyone here has used Tailwind. It's kind of a new-ish thing. So who here has used Tailwind before? Nice. How many of you have heard about Tailwind before? And how many of you have, or writes CSS actually, and cares about that? Okay, nice. That's actually a really good audience then, since like you don't know anything about it, but you do care about CSS. I'm going today to talk about Tailwind, and I'm going to split it into 3 parts. So first, I'm just going to explain the basic concepts. And then I'm going to set up how you use Tailwind in Gatsby to make it kind of Jamstack related. But I will say that like everything related to Tailwind can be used in any kind of stack. And finally, I will talk what I've been calling it like principles of Tailwind, which is kind of like my experiences with Tailwind, and it's my opinions about when you should use it, how you should use it, when you should not use it. And hopefully that will clarify some things, because if you just want to go to the basic concepts, some of you might say like, what? Why? Why does this even make sense? And I will try to justify that later. I also have some time for questions at the end, but always feel free to ask questions during the talk as well. And like, don't be afraid to ask questions or like be afraid of interrupting me. I will just like, if it's a question that I can answer there and then, I will do it. And if not, I will just say, okay, we'll take it later. So anything questions so far? Anything unclear? Oh, and also the nice thing about using Tailwind in Gatsby now is that then I'll have like a live preview, and I can write CSS and I can show you things. So if you have like questions, I can demonstrate things, and it's more. I can do some live coding, and hopefully that will work. It never will, of course, but hopefully. All right. So Tailwind is what is called a utility CSS framework. And this was, I'm not sure where it started, but I heard about this concept first with tachyons, which is another CSS framework. And I'm sure there are other alternatives as well. So the concept behind the utility CSS framework is that you have these classes that are very focused on just one specific styling. So you would have a class that says text center, and all it does is text align center. And you would have a class that's like MB4, and that is then margin bottom, and a spacing of 4, where it means like 1 is a tiny space, 2 is a bit more space, 3 is a bit more, and 4 is a decent amount of space. And then the way you use it is that you just add classes to your HTML. So it's really simple. And Tailwind has a bunch of these classes. So you can change the text, either make it larger or smaller, change the line height, font size or font family, sans serif, you can turn it bold or semi-bold, and you have these helpers for margins and paddings, and then you see you just use M and P, because margins and paddings are so common, they have a very short prefix there. And then you have Y for the vertical direction and X for the horizontal direction. So you can say like I just want some spacing in certain direction. And you also have like top T, L, R, B for top left and such. And you can set colors, you can set borders, you can set shadow, rounded, flex also is supported, and all kind of good stuff. And in addition to all of these classes, you have pseudo classes. So if you want like the hover to be underlined once you mouse over something, you just use the hover colon underline. And yeah, this is actually a valid CSS class. It looks a bit funky at first, but it's valid and works perfectly fine. It is also responsive, so you can say like I want the margin top 4, but on medium screens I want the margin top of nothing. And similar, like small screens, I want it to be text aligned. Normally I want it to be center aligned. And of course you could wonder like, do I need to memorize all of these properties? But luckily they have a really great documentation. So you can like see all of the different things you can do, and examples with the class name and the actual properties that it applies, and also examples. And typically there's also examples with like showing responsive and some pseudo classes as well. So here they have, and there's a search as well. So if you're wondering about something like underline, you can find it, and there it is. And another great thing about Tailwind, as it comes out by default, is the color palette. So they defined a default color palette that is not really based on any, it's not material design or Apple or anything, it's just like a separate palette. And then you have black, some grays, red, orange, yellow, green, teal, blue, indigo, purple, and pink. And it's very nice when you're starting something, because you can just start using colors. And over time, you might remove some of them. Maybe you will add like your brand color. But usually, I find it's very nice to just have, like having reds and having greens and having yellow is very nice for alerts and all sorts of things. And it's a very nice shade of gray as well. So this is a very nice starting point. And then, like the most important thing about Tailwind is not actually all of these classes. So if you saw in this example here, we have like text large, text small, font sans, font serif. All of this is configurable. So by default, it has defined that large, and we can actually see it in the documentation. If I can click on the, get the browser, yeah. Text size. Okay, bad example. I can't find the text size. It's font size. So by default, they have like the text size small is this value. But if you want, you can always just reconfigure it yourself, and you can set it to whatever you want. So if you don't think that if you have a different set of sans fonts or a different set of serif fonts, you can pick and choose whatever you want. And as I will explain more later, this is kind of like the main point about Tailwind. So this is like the basic concepts behind what Tailwind is. So it's first a utility CSS approach, where you have these CSS classes that you will use to style your application. It has really great built-in support for responsive classes, and comes with a really like a sensible defaults. So often you can just start using the defaults and get pretty quickly going. And at the same time, everything is customizable. And I often like to think about Tailwind as kind of framework for building a framework, because it gives you like a tool to create all of the classes you need. So it's like, yeah, the framework. And yeah, I guess that makes like the implementation of Tailwind the framework. But I'm not sure what you would use that for other than creating the framework. Yeah, so all of this is like simple and easy. And often when I like describe this to someone, then they often react with like, why would you do all of this? Like, why can't you just write inline styles? Why can't you just, this makes no sense. What do these classes really like, why do they help you? And before that, I'm just going to show you that No, actually, I'd just like to reflect 1 second on the thing that when I first encountered Tailwind, I kind of had the same reaction when I encountered React. So my first reaction when I encountered React was that it was really horrible. It was like, why would you mix JavaScript with HTML? Why would you do all of these horrible things? And then I ignored it for a while, and eventually some people told me, oh, you should really check it out. And then I tried it, and for some reason it turned out to be really great. And that kind of left me with this feeling that sometimes if you look at something and it looks really, really silly, that means you should look at it. All right, so I actually set this up now, and oops, daisy. Live coding is a risky business. Let's see if everything is proper now. And whoop. So when you set up Gatsby by default, you have this nice structure here with all of your sources and all of your files. So Gatsby is, I should maybe mention that as well. So Gatsby is a static site website generator that runs in Node. And it's kind of like becoming a leading solution for when you want to generate static websites. You will write all of your components in React, and it has a bunch of sources where you can fetch your data from. So it's kind of like just a tool for building, generating HTML. And as such, you need something to write CSS in, or you need to write CSS for your styles, for your site. So by default, it ships with this huge layout.css file, which just seems very generated. Probably comes from normalized or something. I don't think any human would really write this kind of code, but be my guest. So the way you configure Tailwind in Gatsby is actually really, really easy, because Tailwind uses post-CSS to do the processing. So you would use Gatsby together with post-CSS, and then you can configure, and then you can remove all of the styling. Maybe I should just do it like this. See, I kind of lied when I said I wanted to program live, because I'm afraid of making mistakes, so I actually did everything before. So you would add the dependencies to add post-CSS and Tailwind CSS. And you need this configuration file for post-CSS to say, I want to use Tailwind CSS. And then in your CSS file, you can start using the @Tailwind. So Tailwind is separated into 3 parts. You have the base, which sets a baseline styling. And then there are the components, which are extra components, and then all of the utilities classes. And the reason why these are split in 3 is because sometimes, because of specificity, you might want to add something in between. And same, you might want to remove the base if you don't. That's the same thing as normalized.css. So maybe you are not interested in having the proper base styling. Maybe you actually want to work with a strange default styling from the browser for some reason. And once you have this in place, you can actually start using Tailwind. So if things are working properly, I can show you a few examples. So here we go. So here we have a component for the header, and I actually just tried to, by default, this was using inline styles, so I just replaced them with the similar Tailwind styles. I guess I need to open it as well. And there we have the header. So the header one, we want the header to be background purple with an 800 and just some margin at the bottom, which we actually, I think we can see there. So for instance, if I tweak the purple, we can get another one. Maybe we then want the text to be black instead. Oh, no. See? I did save it. Isn't there a black? I feel there should be a black. Oh, because there is another. See, there is another text white inside. And there we go. Yeah, because the text size, no, the text color was set on the link itself. So the text color had a text black, or it had a text white. I can bring it back to text white. And it specified no underline, but when you do the mouse over, you want an underline. So then you get this effect here. So mainly, I just follow there's a tutorial on the Gatsby site. And my main reason for showing this is mainly to have this environment that I can start doing things in if needed. All right. Any comments or questions about Gatsby? Are any of you using Gatsby in some sense? All right. So, but mainly, Tailwind is using, or most of the time you use Tailwind together with PostCSS. So anything that integrates with PostCSS works very nice with Tailwind. You can also use it standalone as an NPM package, and then you can generate a file. But often you get, I feel like you get a better experience if you use it together with the whole PostCSS world. So, we looked at all of these utility classes, and it seems a bit strange, and like, why would you do all of these things? So I have what I've discovered is that there's 4 things that are very important if you want to use Tailwind, or this. If you care about these things, then Tailwind is very useful. So the first thing is that Tailwind is a framework for building custom designs. So if you're interested in just getting some nice forms, Tailwind is not for you. And of course, I find it rather easy to get quickly going with building decent forms, but you need to do that initial work yourself. And so if you're interested in this a final solution that has everything built in, then just don't use Tailwind and don't expect it. It's not that kind of framework. And the other thing is that, and this is maybe more on the, this is kind of the crucial point. And that is we're very used to HTML being a semantic markup language. So you have this paragraph, and you want to attach all this information, and then it's all completely, it's not related to styling at all. And it's pretty great. This is what the web was built for originally. But then we also have this thing that happened where the web became really popular, and people started they wanted to style their sites. And even though HTML is totally about markup, you ended up with all of these divs because that's the way you use things on the web. And this thing is no longer really about markup. This thing is all about styling. The only reason why you have a div in these places is because of the box model in CSS, and because you wanted the subtitle to be somewhere around. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, in this point, the fact that we have HTML and CSS separated it isn't really separated here. We haven't gotten this perfect world where you mark up your content and you can style it however you want. We have this world where you just need to tweak the HTML to fit the CSS, and so forth. And of course, some people like to think that, oh, but no, this is actually just a header, and I can style it in so many different ways. And in my experience, it's yeah, there's some ways you can style it, but suddenly you want to tweak the design a bit, and then you need to just redo all of the HTML. And therefore, many of these class names kind of become artificial. I have so many wrapper and inner classes, which are really only there to match it with some CSS in a different file. So all you end up doing is creating abstractions or something like that. But you're just really placing the styling of something into very far away places, and are trying to claim that there's some abstraction between there. But really, it's all connected. It's all tightly coupled. And of course, this is where you should use Tailwind. And this is where you should just acknowledge that HTML and CSS is part of the same thing. And more importantly, if you have this type of thing, then you don't want to use Tailwind, or you don't want to use the Tailwind utility classes to style this. It's not like you should take perfectly fine markup language and add the classes about styling. That's just horribly wrong. So just let this be and use CSS to style it as it was meant to be. And then you can just embrace the chaos because there is no separation between anything in HTML and CSS. So for me, like every time I see a div in something, I'm just like, oh, it's only there for layout. There's no really markup. Even the fact that HTML is a markup language, it's not there for markup. And this was everything I was supposed to say. Great slides. So this is kind of like, for me, it took me a while to realize this, which is kind of silly of me. But for a long time, I thought like, oh, but the divs are really descriptive, and you have like header and title, and it's all really there, so I can change the CSS and style it however I want, and it's a very nice separation. And some of you might remember like CSS Zen Garden, which was kind of like based on the concept that you have one HTML file and tons of styling. And it's a pretty cool concept, but once you start looking into the CSS, it's often so horrendously ugly because it's really trying to. It's not really. You notice that CSS is not really designed to restructure content like that, and it's just way better once you like embrace the chaos and just say that everything is just like one big bag of layout. In the same sense that, for me at least, React show that HTML and JavaScript is also kind of the same big bag of doing user interfaces. And then the next part, which many complains about, is like, oh no, but I end up having to repeat all of these things. Like every time I want a button, do I then need to say BG, blue, 500, text, white, rounded, PY2, PX4 or something? And of course not. But you need to bring your own abstractions. So for instance, in the React world, you would have a component that's called button. And you want this component either way because you want to normalize all of your behavior and all of the actions and everything how it works. And then this is a perfect place to also put all of your styling. So you still have everything in one place. You're not repeating all of these. I was actually pretty close to writing out the class names. So this kind of, and most of the time, you have this abstraction already. You're using a framework, and if you're on server side, you have like often partials or something like that. So you might as well just reuse it for styling as well. And once you are in this world, you can actually, like you don't need to come up with this silly class name to explain what this is, because this div here is only here to style it in a certain way. And I guess, like strictly speaking, this should be a button element, but this works as well. So it's very, once again, like if you are only dealing with plain HTML files, then you don't have a way of creating abstractions, then you shouldn't use Tailwind. Because then you're just like causing a big mess. Because you're not supposed to copy paste these around. If you start copy pasting this around, then you're doing something wrong. But if you're just like tweaking them, and if you're like, oh, this looks better with a different shade of gray, and then you can just tweak it immediately there, then everything is nice. And then the last part, which is what I find mostly, or maybe the main part that's empowering about Tailwind, is that really the way I think about Tailwind is that it's there to create a design language. So notice that in the utility classes, you had like MB1, MB2, MB3, MB4, and that 1, 2, 3, and 4 is not pixels. It's just like a new unit. It's like 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's like tiny space, bit more space, even more space, and more space. And the same thing with the colors. You start thinking about like the shades of the colors. And you should really take this language that Tailwind has started with, and you should customize it yourself, and you should tweak it. Because then you're left with fewer choices. So you either like in the mode, yeah, I want this to be yeah, needs some more space, and then you have like a scale you can work with. So in a sense, I find that once you start customizing Tailwind, and especially removing options, it's a way of enforcing a style guide. You're saying that everything that's rounded should be rounded in this way. And then you will get a really consistent style across your whole site. So you can start with the defaults, but very quickly you should really go in there and remove things. You can add your own, especially with colors. You typically want to add your own brand color. But the more things you remove, the more consistent your site will be. And it kind of, yeah, I feel like it forces you to create a style guide, even though like creating an actual style guide takes a lot of time, and you need to, yeah, I'm not going to do that, sorry. I wish I had time to do it, though. So these are kind of like, I have more examples. So yeah, for instance, you start thinking more in, if you're thinking in the CSS world, and if you're writing a lot of CSS, you're constantly thinking like, oh yeah, I want a border radius of how many pixels. But once you start thinking in the Tailwind world, you start thinking like, oh, this box should be rounded. And of course, with spacing, it's always a bit tricky, because sometimes the spacing you just need to do by eye. You can't just like calculate it, or there's not like a perfect amount of space. So then you kind of like need this scale in a sense. But I find like just having reduced the possibilities from like an infinite amount of M's into just like 5 spaces, it's so much easier once you start doing these custom designs. And same with shadow. Like if you're doing anything with shadow, then there's like so many things you can tweak. And by default with Tailwind, you get like, yeah, this is something that gives you a shadow. Question?
Yeah, so building blocks is sort of the same as abstractions, right? Like you could say the same thing about buttons. Like that's a building block as well. That's a collection of styles. Where do you draw that line between, okay, use the framework's abstractions versus just like
Yeah. So there's 2 things. So first of all of this is configurable. So they have chosen a default value for what rounded means, and what py2 means, and px4 means, and what shadow means. So you can always override that. And now I'm using like the default rounded, and they have like rounded big and rounded small, and that is it. But you can introduce more roundedness if you want. I think also they have like a thing for making something completely a circle. And same with shadow. But it's more about Tailwind by default doesn't tell you how to combine this. So typically in like Bootstrap, they say like if you have a form, you should have a form group, you should have a control, you should have a label, it should be like this. And they're saying like this is exactly how the HTML should be and how these compose together. With Tailwind, they're very honest, like rounded. This just sets the border radius. That's all it does. And you have to build your components yourself. And same with shadow, it just sets a box shadow. So they're not trying to tell you how to build these things together, and you yourself have to decide for that. Does that answer your question? I forgot the thing where I was supposed to repeat the question because people are listening. Sorry, Knut. Okay. Oh, cool. So the question was about how to, like this sort of building blocks is an abstraction, and well, now you can see if I interpret it correctly. And other similar frameworks kind of have the same sort of collection. You can say that many CSS frameworks is just like a collection of different classes you can use. And then what is the difference between these types of classes and what more normal frameworks use? Was that the correct interpretation?
can I rephrase? So I think the Tailwind author himself once said that, okay, maybe even creating your own button class is okay if you just inherit or compose several Tailwind button classes.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the same thing as abstractions as you showed earlier, right? So instead of having a button React component, maybe you could just like create a button Tailwind
Okay, sorry.
inherits similar.
Nice. That was a sneaky question. You knew the answer.
I'm curious about your thoughts. If he's changed his mind.
Okay, so the question was more a comment, which is fine. I like comments. So the author of Tailwind himself and Tailwind provide a way to group the things into classes. So it's not like you can never use a single class in CSS. And actually, they have this syntax, which I can actually show you if I can get out of my browser in the CSS. So they have this thing called @apply. So you can write a normal type of CSS, and then you can use @apply, and you can use the same sort of utility classes. So this means that if you are actually creating, you can actually do this. If I find my button, I'm not sure where I have the button thing. So if you want a button like this, maybe it should be BG, text white, rounded, px2, py4. So if you want, you can create your own classes, and you can then apply the same styling as you use in Tailwind or with the normal utility classes. And then if I find the page, I should now be able to reuse this same I should start using button for buttons. I'm just like 15 years late. So there you see. So yeah, and this is kind of like the same conceptually. I feel like it's the same idea that you need to bring your own, kind of bring your own abstractions. You're free to create your own abstractions, and you're free to write your own CSS. So for instance, in this project, I also used I wanted to style my links, and then you are free to use apply to pull in then the regular Tailwind classes as well. And the same goes with any custom classes. You can just create a button class if you want. And often, in my experience, this works very great for like buttons and links and simple things. But once you start having like complicated components, then it's probably better to do some other sort of abstraction where you can put all of the HTML as well. Was that better?
Yeah.
Nice.
I'm just curious about the apply syntax there. Does it add the classes to the HTML, or does it create a new class that's button that's have all the class included?
Yeah, it creates a new class. Okay, so the question was, what exactly does apply do? And the way it works is that this works on the CSS level. So this will then look at the definitions of all of these classes and put them into the button class. So if you use this, you don't need any custom HTML. It's not like the HTML is pre-processed and looks for button. It's that the CSS generates, I guess I should be able to find it as well. The CSS generates a class that looks like this. I'm not sure how to zoom here. It was Command plus. Whoa. Okay, yeah. So this kind of makes it possible to use the same design language as using regular CSS classes.
Is there like a less or SAS implementation of it seems like something you could build in less?
Yeah, so the question here was whether there's a version that's based on less or SAS. And no, and the way, or at least not that I've found the last time I looked for it. So the way Tailwind is created is sort of like a bunch of JavaScript code that generates all of these classes. But as mentioned, you can accomplish many of the similar things using maybe just like native SAS, or maybe with less as well, or something that takes SAS and generates all of these things. And actually, initially, when I looked at Tailwind, I really wanted, like, I was originally using it for a project in Ruby. And in Ruby, they have like built-in support for compiling SAS. So for me, it would be great if I could use it inside SAS, because I then don't need to have Node as a dependency. And I couldn't really, I tried to look into the Tailwind implementation and see if I could like get the same styles generated with SAS. And I wasn't really able to, because it's all a bunch of JavaScript, which all CSS seems to end up doing these days with the post-CSS library. So I kind of wish that the default settings and all configurations and all of these choices were more declaratively defined somewhere, so I could use them other places. But for now, it's all just like stuck into this world of JavaScript. And I think there are some other frameworks that do the same thing that might be related or based on Sass. I wonder if Tachyons is based on Sass. But in my experience, it's just like Tailwind is so well designed and is well maintained. So it's kind of like it's so much nicer using Tailwind that I rather use Webpack and configure Webpack in other places than to try to find something that works with Sass and less. If that's yeah. You know, I feel like some of these concepts would be more reusable instead of having it stuck inside the JavaScript world. But at the same time, part of the power comes from the fact that it's all in JavaScript.
So does it have any support for CSS variables or things like that?
So the question was whether it supported CSS variables, and then you mean like native CSS variables? Yeah, no, I don't think I've seen any, or I haven't used it with CSS variables. Maybe there's like a plugin for it on NPM. But at the same time, I feel like you can always, because it's a framework that you are supposed to start with a CSS file, you can always create your own utilities. And so if you want to use like you can just add like a text foo, which then should use color var foo, I guess. And you can end up having your own. But it wouldn't surprise me if someone's created a plugin that does all of this generation for you. But I haven't looked into using it with CSS variables myself. Yeah, I should. CSS variables are way more powerful than you could imagine, especially if you don't care about supporting all the browsers. Yeah, so this was kind of like the point that I made while using Tailwind, and especially what I've discovered when discussing Tailwind with other people. So I also had like a time for questions, and I actually had like some prepared questions, because this is what the usual, like people usually say. Like usually they say like it's not semantic, and I would reply that's not the question, and then I would say but you use it for user interface and custom design. You don't use it for styling the markup. And similarly, like why can't I just want some nice forms, and then you use something else. And I wish there was like this perfect world when you can have this framework that gives you everything out of the box, and you can configure it and not, hate your life. But I feel like you sometimes like either you are stuck within some framework, or you use a framework that has it's very loose and allows lots of flexibility. And then Tailwind is one of the last ones. And same thing, like, isn't it very repetitive? It is if you repeat yourself, so don't repeat yourself, use abstractions. And yeah, and many people say like, oh, why isn't this just like inline styles? And that's actually a good point, because inline styles is kind of similar. So the point there is that the Tailwind approach is all about limiting your choices. And once again, thinking about the design language, you start thinking about rounded instead of having to repeat the same thing what rounded means. And there's another case. This generates really bloated CSS. So like all of the combinations in all of the different sizes and all of the different responsiveness and all of the hover and focus creates just like this huge CSS file. Luckily, you have something called it's called Purge CSS. Which then goes over your application, and it tries to see which classes you use, and then it just removes the classes that are not used. So first you have this like huge CSS file, and then you use Purge CSS, and it just shrinks completely. So it feels kind of ugly in a sense, like you start with this big thing and you just remove random stuff, or it's not random. But like in practice, it's one of these things that once again just seems to work really great, and it just removes all of the CSS you don't use, and yeah, it just works. All right. More questions? Yeah. Oh, like for I actually like haven't. I don't know. I haven't looked for help for Tailwind because the documentation is so great. Yeah, but apparently they have a Discord. Um, yeah, 455 online now, 3,000 members. But I will also like. I think it's a fair point that their documentation is so great that like I've Googled for very little Tailwind stuff because it's usually right there in documentation, and for me that's like one of the reasons why I sticked with this and not one of the other approaches. So, but they have also pretty active on GitHub issues, and yeah, it seems like a well-maintained project. And also, they recently released the version 1, so they had like version 0.7, and then they cleaned up a bunch of stuff in version 1. So that was, for me, also a good thing to see that a project is willing to like look at all of these things, see, okay, we made some mistakes here, and they just like cleaned everything up and made everything better, instead of like being stuck in this world where they always want to maintain support for the older version. So now they have one branch supported, but they have like gone past and really cleaned up everything, and it's everything feels even nicer in version 1 than it did in version 07, which is yeah, it's a good compliment to the maintainers. Yeah, so the question was about gotchas in this framework. I'm not sure about like gotchas. There's because it's really selling itself as it is. It's really telling you, yeah, this is just for writing classes. It's like it's a framework that generates tons of classes for you. So I guess like I felt like. Oh, so there's actually like one case which is not maybe a gotcha, but kind of like an annoyance, and that is once, like if you misspell something, or if you use a class name that's not defined, then you got no error message from it. Like, and and if you write in CSS, you usually get like a syntax error, or like your highlighter will help you. But if you mistype a class name somewhere, at least in the HTML file, then it's from the browser's point of view, it's just a CSS class that doesn't work. So I had some cases where typically with colors, right, they are like text blue 500, and I forget the 500, and it's like, why isn't my text blue? And then it can take a while to catch these things. So I guess that's kind of like one gotcha that or annoyances that I've experienced. There was another question? So the question was on some sites, when the CSS grows really big, you want to be able to chunk it into smaller generated files, and then on a given page only load the styles that you use. So I luckily haven't had that problem with creating so much CSS, so I haven't tried it in practice. But this is all based around post-CSS. So I'm guessing if you can solve it today with post-CSS and some sort of plugins, then you will be able to accomplish the same thing here. But I haven't tried it, so I don't really know how well that works. It should also be mentioned that like this at Tailwind, you can replace them with an import. and just a regular import, and that might make it easier to make it work with the whole post CSS and importing and thing. Yeah, you really want to combine it with some purge CSS kind of thing if you're about controlling the file size. Like if you get the chunking but you lose the purging of CSS, then you really lost the war. Because they have like, yeah, on the website they show here like original size with Tailwind with nothing else is 477 kilobytes. And Bootstrap is 186.87. So it's really huge once you like, and it's so silly. It's like it's just repeating all of the CSS properties. But then they have like an example. Yeah, Firefox Send is built with Tailwind, and it's only 13 kilobytes minified because they use some purging that works nicely. And maybe it will actually cause like less issue with size because more things are reused. I'm not sure how that actually will affect the final size, because once you have like write regular CSS, you often repeat the same things. So maybe here there's less repetition in the CSS, but maybe your JavaScript or HTML becomes bigger because you reuse the same class names. I haven't used that scale, so I don't really know. Another question? So the question was, here I'm using Gatsby, and then you're kind of like in this big framework that has everything. And if you're then using something else, how would you use? Yeah, so if you're using something else, like how would you get the purge CSS feature? Right, so the thing about the purge CSS is that purge CSS is not very smart. So it's not like it's actually going into your code and finding all the class names. All it does is it goes through your project and it finds everything that looks like a class name. And if that class name is present, then it keeps it. So if you somewhere just have a comment where you write text-blue-500, then it keeps it. So therefore, it's very flexible. It works regardless of any framework. It's not like something needs to be able to figure out all of the class names. But at the same time, there will be false positives, true, false, false negatives. And I always forget what the correct false something. And at the same time, if you try to do something funky, like you say like class name equals text dash, if something class name plus equals blue, then actually purge CSS will remove that class name because it can't find it in there. Yes, so the solution to that problem is to just like, you can combine, don't split up a class name. You can still like, as long as the class name is in the full, completely present, then you can use it. So it's very crude, but surprisingly specific. No, surprisingly, yeah, I mean, you're probably like the underline class will probably be included no matter what, because like if there's just some place where you write underline, or like font sans, it will add it. But on the plus side, it's you can use it with any framework, anything at all, and it's pretty great. Yeah, any more questions? Another one, nice. Yeah, yeah, you can stack them as much as you want, and they will work together. And yeah, and same with the different breakpoints. You can have combinations of them and multiple ones. But often once you start, like that's maybe one of the part where I find it nice to use the CSS class helper thing, use apply, like if you want, because it gets really hover. It's kind of verbose. And I mean, this is really a framework for being pragmatic. So if something is annoying you and you find a better solution, then yeah, of course, there's nothing wrong with creating another class. There's nothing. I feel like it's very based about being pragmatic about what works in practice. So I've definitely done this before just to get the noise down. Yeah. Another question?
What about applying styling to a child when the parent is over?
Yeah.
Yeah,
They have a. Whoa, this is really big, which is, well, kind of nice for you, I guess. They have a group concept. No, not a button group. So you can set, let's see, is this a group? Here we go. So you can set the group on something. So here there's a group on the, whoa, hey Siri. Oops. There's a group on this white button. And then you have a group hover pseudo class, which then targets when the group is hovered. So this works on one level. If you have a multiple nested one, it won't work. But this is usually sufficient in my experience when you want to do these things. And once you start doing more complicated things, you need to go back into the CSS and write your custom stuff. But it's, yeah. It works decently, in my experience. Right, so the question was, how would you go about integrating this into an existing app? So if you, for instance, have an existing app with tons of custom styling or a different framework, how would you go about doing this? And there are a few nice things you can do. So for instance, you can configure Tailwind to use a prefix. So every class will be prefixed with something. So you can do this to make sure you're not breaking anything else. And then you can just start using this wherever you want. And another thing is that if you want to maintain the previous classes, you might consider to take the previous classes and rewrite them into using apply. So if you then start defining your colors, so maybe in the old CSS you have the colors all spread around, or copy-pasted from file to file, then you can start using a Tailwind, have a proper Tailwind color thing. And then you can go back in these previous classes and start adding applies instead. And then slowly you will turn all of the old CSS into a thing that uses Tailwind. And then suddenly everything is configurable. And then it's always is it worth going into back old HTML files and also change back to use Tailwind? Is kind of, I'm not sure. It's a tricky trade-off. But at least as long as the fact that you can use a prefix means that you can always use it for new stuff. Refactoring old projects is hard, or figuring out what to change and what to keep. All right. One more. So, the 100, 200. Yeah, so these colors are not generated from anything. They are it's not like they've chosen a base color and then they are automatically generated. They actually have how can I find the default colors? Yeah, they are actually written like this in the source code. So if you want to change some of the shading, you need to do the work yourself and find different things that fits. So they actually make a point of it that yeah, you can use this ID with you choose a single color and then generate all of the shades automatically. But what they're saying is that it gives better results if you do it all manually. So they've done it all manually. Also, what I would do is to not have all of these shades. So if I would tweak the color palettes, I would just only focus on the ones I know I need. But they kind of provide the full palette because they don't know if you're going for a dark design or a light design, or yeah. Yeah. So this. Yeah. So this is the naming convention is very similar to material design, as you mentioned, and also it should be said that in the previous version, 0.7, instead they had like. That's also why I may keep doing the mistake. There you had text-blue, and then you had text-blue dark, and darker, and darkest. And you have text-blue light, lighter, lightest. And then in the version 1, they changed it to use a scale, which is a bit easier to add things between. So like in the previous approach, I wanted to have like a color between darker and darkest. And it was like darkest-ish. So even though they only provide the 100, 200, 300, 400, yeah, and you should also be aware that you can't like use 150. That it's nothing automatic like that. But at least they give you a way to put, or a place where you can put the shade 150. Oh, that's actually a good question, because in the news version, I didn't really customize much. But luckily, we will hope that documentation works. And so all of this, why do you put files in different folders? You need a tailwind.config.js file. So everything is configured through this file. And then the theme property is like where you set the theme. And extend is for extending things. And if you don't do extend, you will overwrite everything. So especially with nested things, you will then just like remove everything. I would like actually recommend to not use extend, or like if you do it properly, you don't extend, but you redefine it and you limit your choices. But initially, you can just change. Let's see if we can change one of the blue ones. So I used a blue 700 somewhere, and we can make it like not blue. That should be very visible. So now the question is whether the auto reloader knows how to reload. Where did my cursor go? Yeah, I'm guessing the auto reloader doesn't know that the config file changed. But hopefully now it should be gray. So now in the config file, I said we should extend the colors, and then I want to override the blue 700 to this gray instead. That was good enough? Or answered your question? Yeah. All right, I think we're good. Thank you.